You're going to hear why I said the ambiences, getting them right was really what felt like it brought this song to life. So hear that without the rooms and without the snare verb. Hear what the snare sounds like just trying to do it all on its own. Sounds like MIDI drums, right? To me, that sounds like fake drums, like programmed drums. Bring in the room, bring in the snare verb, and we have this. To me, that is super important, super important. Want to see how I got the drum sound to this song? This is Shattered Glass by a band called No Sweet Dreams, and if you want to hear that song in full, the link will be in the description. Just quickly, if you make music like this and you want me to mix your next release, then head over to my website, terrybeckleyrecording.com, hit me up via the contact form, I will get back to you, the link is in the description. When I was mixing these drums, I didn't really feel them come to life until I got the reverbs and ambience right, which makes sense as this song is more on the ballad side of pop punk. Starting with the actual drum instruments and samples that I used, and you might find this a little crazy, but I'm using 4 different drum instruments. So first off, I've got the Modern and Massive from GGD, and all I'm using from here are the toms, the kick, and then the room sound too. As you can see, I've swapped the toms out for the custom Birch Yamaha ones here. So routed out of the plugin, we've got shell room, the toms, and the kick in there. So next up, I've got the pop punk kit, One Kit Wonder from GGD. And from this, I'll be using the snare because it's my favourite snare, the toms and the room sounds. So routed out from there, punk room, the toms and the snare. So I've also got the Drumforge Ultimate going. We've got everything running from this one. So we've got kick, we've got the blend of 2 different snares, the toms. So you see routed out there, kick. I've got the snare, blend of 2 snares, the toms, the hi-hat, the ride, the overheads and the room. And then also on top of all of this is the Logic Drummer toms. And then lastly, I'm using Logic's drummer for the tom sounds and the rooms that come with them. So it's these toms here, which are the modern maple toms, and I've grabbed the room track also. So you've got the 3 toms and the room track. So altogether, that does seem a little mad. But when we get into the mix now, I'll walk through why I've chosen these particular sounds and what they give into the overall drum sound. So these tracks here are all of those MIDI bounced out on those different outputs that you saw. So starting with kick, this is the kick from the Modern and Massive, the MM there, Modern and Massive kick. I've also got a kick trigger track happening, which is triggering off of that same track there. And then we've got the Drumforge kick also. So the overall kick sound is comprised of these 3. So Modern and Massive sounds like this. And that is my main kick sound here. Kick trigger sounds like this, it's more of a roomy tone. And then kick in is a lot more of a punchy sound. And with that Drumforge kick, if it ever gets a little bit too strong, I will only have it for choruses and that kind of thing. But on this song, we've got it running the whole way through. So the whole kick all together, with the plugins turned off, sounds like this. And as you'll see on the individual tracks themselves, I don't actually do any mixing. I've chosen those sounds specifically so that I can just do it all on the kick bus. The first up is I'm using this distressor plugin for compression, set to a 4:1 ratio, and I've made it so it's not as aggressive as it can be. I've slowed the attack down to just about 7.5 and the release to about 2.5. So I'm getting a lot of that transient in there, but I'm not making it overly attack heavy. And I chose that compressor on purpose. Usually, I would want to use something like the 1176 and do a similar thing where you make the release really quick and slow the attack down. But I was finding that actually it does a really good job, this compressor, of cleaning up your low end of your kick, making it really tight in the low end. But I was sort of losing the presence of the beef of the kick by doing that, and it was bringing out the attack a little bit too hard. So that's why I went with the distressor instead, and then into some EQ. So if I walk through this one step by step, this here is the first thing I would have done. That's taken out the chirpiness to the kick. If you've seen any of my other drum mixing videos, I always kill this frequency because it drives me mad. It sounds like a bird chirping. I've got to pull that out of my attack every single time. And this filter here is a very gentle slope just to make sure that it's not too boomy. You know, if I had used the 1176 to compress it, I probably wouldn't need it to be here as much, but I sort of wanted some of that low end to have a bit more of a tail on it, so I'm just controlling it with this filter here. And then we've got a little bit of boominess that probably wouldn't have been a problem until I started the mastering of it, and I realized that, oh, okay, with all of that limiting and compression on it now, it's sort of starting to build up too much. These are only gentle cuts, so we've got one at 40, and then one at 60, which is probably the sort of fundamental of the kick. So I'm not killing that fundamental, I'm just bringing it down literally by a decibel. Now with all the EQ moves, because they're sampled drums and they sound good anyway, one of the biggest mistakes I always made when I was learning was I was over EQing sampled drums. You know, I definitely think you need to EQ hard on real acoustic live drums, but these sampled ones that sound good and clear anyway, and they haven't got bleed and those kinds of things, you can just make them sounding really, you can really strip too much out or really overemphasize certain things, and it loses the coherence of the drum kit. Starts to sound really fake. So I'll play this off and on, but I bet you it's going to be pretty subtle. Yeah, pretty subtle. You can kind of hear a little boost here where I've done it at 125. That's because once the mix was coming together and the bass was in, I wanted to push a bit more of this low part of the kick through, but I didn't want it to be these boomy areas down here. So I found a nice place on this kick that actually it still gives it some of that weight, but doesn't make it as boomy. Might not always be an advisable thing to do, especially if you've got guitars that have a lot of like 125 sort of rumble in them. But in this case, we didn't. And then into the boosting side of my EQs, very gentle slope at 50, and then it's a kick. So traditionally, you wouldn't have anything above this in acoustic drums because you've got so much cymbal bleed, or you might have a little bit of cymbal bleed depending on how well the kick was recorded. And I also think with the samples, if the top end is too clear, like you've got too much of this like above sort of 8, 9K, that can start to sound a bit separate from the rest of the kit. Maybe because traditionally we've always heard songs with that brought back because of the bleed. It starts to be very obviously a sample, so that's why I pulled that back there. Let's play the kick with this bypass and I'll bring it in. We'll hear the difference and then we'll go through each move. Yeah, see, we are bringing that kick to life, but we're opening it up a little bit. We're not doing anything too crazy because it's already a good sounding kick. If this was a real kick drum, I'd probably work a lot harder, have a lot more going on in these boosts here. So there's 3 important frequencies. I've got a bell curve boosting around 70 to just under 80 hertz basically to give it some weight. Then we've got sort of like it's the attack of the kick, but it's not the proper top end click. It's like a more dirty one down at sort of 4K, and that's very, very slight, 1.5 dB. And then the 8K clickiness, adding just under 3 decibels of that. But be careful with this boost because you can make things sound really clicky, and that's not really how pop punk drums are supposed to sound. So I'll put all these to 0 and we'll go through them one by one. So we'll go with the low end 77 boost, then I'll add in the 4K, then I'll add in the 8K. Yeah, it's that 8K boost that's really bringing it to life, doing the most work there. Okay, so for the rest of these, we should listen to them in context of the whole mix, or at least the instrumental. So we have a compressor with a fast release, slow attack. We've got a multi-band compressor, but that is just maintaining the low end of our kick there. And like I said before, where this 1176 can tighten up the low end of it too much and take away the weight, this little compression and boost here is going to bring that back for us. And then something really important that I've been doing recently is this clipper plugin here. And this is going to give our kick enough energy and loudness so that we hear all of the kick rather than just a couple of frequencies poking through. And because it's a clipper, it's not going to limit it, make it sound lifeless. It's actually going to do the opposite. And then after the clipper, we've just got another cut here because it would have sounded a little bit too clicky for me. So let's bring them all in context of the whole instrumental. Yeah, so you see how they all sort of work together to give the kick its its shape, its feel, its energy. But I just wanted to focus on the clipper for a second, and this clipper in particular, because I always knew that clipping would help, but the problem was I never really found one that didn't do things to the EQ balance of the kick. And this one here seems to, I don't know what it does, but it seems to leave it mostly intact and just literally brings it up and makes it more energetic. Listen to it without the clipper and I'll bring it in. Yeah, and it's cool. I've actually got it running on the kick and the snare and again in mastering, but we'll get to that. Okay, so next up is the snare. This snare top track is actually what the band sent me. It's quite a bright sounding snare, so I've got my main snare running for the whole track, and then during the verses, I've pulled out this one because it was overkill for the verses, and then the choruses, it gives the snare and the big sections quite a decent lift. So it sounds like this. So it's got a lot of snare bottom in there in terms of the bottom mic, not the bottom EQ. And it really did help lift the snare in those moments. So this is the punk snare, the One Hit Wonder pop punk snare. I love that snare. And then this is the blend of the two snares from Drumforge, the 1123. And that's got a bit more of that punch to it. So all together they sound like this. Let's run through what we're doing there. So first thing I do is I shave off the peaks with Saturn 2 or a saturation of some kind. And I got this from CLA, from Chris Lord-Alge, where sampled snares sound so clean because they don't have any, you haven't got to deal with any hi-hat bleed. And it almost, again, starts to sound separate and maybe too fake. So if you just shave off the peaks of MIDI snares or sampled snares, I mean, it's barely noticeable, but it just takes that edge off so you don't hear it being so clean and digital. So first actual thing I'm doing, I suppose, is compressing. And there we are bringing the attack out. So we've got as slow as you can attack, fast as you can release. And that makes our snare sound like this. Yeah, just bringing out that attack. And you can hear with those EQs off now how much we're going to have to do to the EQ of the snare. The snare itself sounds great, but you just need to brighten the whole thing up without making it sounding thin. So that's what we're going to do with these EQs. So SSL channel, we are rolling off, not that it's that important, 77, and then everything above 12. Again, similar to what I was saying with the kick, if you've got that above that 12K in the snare, it sounds a bit like it's too much, too much bottom snare in there anyway for me. It ruins the punch. And that would always be swallowed by cymbals and bleed in traditional snare tracks. So that's why I've got that engaged there. And that actually allows me to do a shelf rather than a bell here at 6K. We've got a boost in a similar aggressive point, so at that 4K point again, like we did with the kick. And that's really going to push it through the guitars and other things like that. Be careful doing that with heavier songs or fuller arrangements with way more distortion, because that's going to get nasty pretty quick. And then we've even got a just under 2K boost here, quite a dramatic one there too. And that's how we bring that snare to life. That's how we got to take it from that dull snare that we got with just the original, with just the samples, and how to wake it up. So let's hear that. I'll keep it bypass and I'll bring it in. See, I'm not changing the character of the snare, I'm just opening it up, bringing some life to it with the sort of higher frequencies. There's also a 200 boost here. From the sample itself, especially the blend, the 1123 Drumforge snares, there's already quite a lot of 200 there. So I'm careful with this, but it's more of a balance. You know, once you start bringing in these EQ moves up here, you might start to get your snare too thin, so you're going to have to follow it up with the punch of the snare too. I'll show you how I've done that. So if I put this back to 0, or listen, I'll bring it in. Yeah, really not that dramatic at all. So followed up by a Pro Q3, and a little bit of that honkiness is being taken out there. So I've done this sort of like boost cut thing here because this 10K area is where snares sound like sneezes, and it can make it sound weak in the whole mix. So I pulled that back, but to not lose the brightness, I've pushed this sort of 6, 7K there. Very subtle. So if I show you this now in context, because coming up, we've got an airband, a 20k airband, quite dramatically pushed in there. But that would only make sense with the whole mix going. A gain plugin, bringing it up another 1.5 decibels, and then we're following it up with a clipper, same as the kick. Let's hear that in context. Yeah, those moves would have sounded overkill in solo, but you can see how necessary they were. If we go back and listen, being used to that snare sound, and I take them out, you'll hear it fall apart. Yeah, there we go. Now, at the beginning of the video, I said about getting the ambiences right, and one of the big parts of this was this snare verb track here. It wasn't until I brought that snare verb in that I really felt like we were getting somewhere. So if you look, I've got a send from the pop punk snare and a send from the 1123 blend, but not from this top snare because it's really, really bright. So if I play the whole track and I take the snare verb away, hopefully you'll hear what it's bringing to the whole vibe, and then we'll look at it in more detail. Let's hear that again with just the snare soloed. Yeah, maybe you thought it was subtle in the mix, but it's quite important. You can hear how dramatic that is there. The snare is just a lifeless click without that verb in there. So what is that verb? Mostly it's this Valhalla Room plugin here, just on large chamber, and the preset is large wood room. I'm sure any sort of wood room reverb sample would work. The only thing that I would mess with is this size here. On Valhalla Room, you've got an early and a late reflections. Probably would just would have been the late that I would have made bigger to make it sound like it's in a larger room. And then this pre-delay here, I've made this quite slow so that you can still get I don't want to muddy up that punch of the snare and that attack. So I've made this late. It makes the reverb kick in a little slower, leaves the attack there, also makes it sound bigger. And then proper funky EQ. I wanted this loud, and to do that, I had to carve some bits out. So that's why we are doing as many cuts as we are. I wanted it bright, but you got to be careful about that because I don't want it to sound sneezy. Cutting out some 3K because it was poking out, went in with the main snare. Cutting out some sort of 1.5K honk, but boosting a bit of that ring, which would have been instead of that mid-range ring that you've got. Cutting out some mud, really cutting out something that was poking out here, this sort of like 400 hertz boxiness. Dealing with the low end of it too. I wanted it to sound like a bright verb. I don't want it to sound muddy. We're rolling off here, and that's why I've also got this shelf dipping 2 decibels of sort of up to about 300 hertz there. Probably won't be able to hear it too much. Let me turn this off and on. You can see how I feel like it's sticking out without these cuts. Yeah, it's a little bit snappy. It's still a bit subtle, but I'm just basically listening to that in context of the whole mix and being like, I can hear the verb. It sounds too artificial, so I'll pull this bit back. Working out what's to leave in there and what to take out. Something that's best done intuitively while you're mixing. And then, like I said, I wanted it bright, so we've got pretty much the same EQ that we had for the snare itself, 20k shelf. And then we've got some compression happening. I don't want to lose the punch by blurring that attack of the kick. So that's why I'm making sure that the verb is sort of moving in the same sort of way with the compressor, with the slower attack, fast release. Then quite a bit of tape saturation on it there. Give it a cool vibe, make it sort of sit better, and then pulling out some extra bit of that sort of muddiness. That's sort of where the punch is going to live with the snare. I don't want it to sound like too fake of a reverb. Okay, moving on to toms and my crazy approach to toms. This is one of the new things that I do because I just felt like every time I was mixing toms, first of all, they're not in the mix until you start to push them into it. They disappear so easily. And then it's so hard to get the right bits to come out. You know, they sound terrible with the mid-range in. in solo, but without that mid-range, they get lost completely. Don't want them to sound too thin. You don't want them to be too boomy because that's going to affect your mix bus and mastering compression too. And the more I tried to mix with EQ, the worse they sort of sounded. So I just decided in the end, I'm just going to layer up my toms like crazy, get lots of tom room in there, and so that I can do less EQ, but I've just got so much happening when the toms hit that you can actually hear them, and they sound way more natural. So there'll be a little bit of processing on these, but not too much. I'll play you a bit with the instrumental with the toms actually coming in, and then I'll play them in solo. Yeah, I always struggle with them because you've got kick and snares happening and they need to gel with those. So you need the brightness of the toms to make sense with the brightness of the snare and kick, but you also need the punch and the low end to sort of sound as tight and as present as it does for the kick. I always struggled, and this is the best solution I have, and I'm actually pretty pleased with it. So we have our Logic toms, like you saw at the beginning of the video. We have modern and massive toms. We have a stereo file with both pop punk toms and a stereo file with both drum forge toms. So there's a lot happening. My reasoning behind the panning is pop punk kit, drum forge kit, they naturally have the toms hard panned. And as I've got the rooms happening there too, I've left them hard panned. As in the left tom is all the way to the left, the floor tom all the way to the right. And to me, I don't usually do that because it sounds wide, but it sounds disconnected. So that's why we've got the Logic toms more conservatively panned, where they would naturally sit within the room, stereo room files. You know, if you were actually recording it in a room, how that would sound if you had a stereo pair of room mics. You've got the rack tom over to the left, the floor tom probably further over to the right. Yeah, so that's why we've got this happening here. So the stereo image is the same, but I've got a bit of glue with those nearer panned ones, and then I've got the wideness from these two, pop punk and drum forge. Also, seems like a lot of work, doesn't it, for literally things you hear so quickly within a mix that sort of come and go. But toms can be cool. All your drama comes from your toms, so you don't want to miss them out. So I think it's best probably to start with the actual tom bus itself that they all go to. Minimal mixing on here because, like I said, I've layered the sounds up. I don't want to start pulling things around because that's when it falls to pieces. So a compressor just to keep all the toms moving together. I've set this up in dual mono because I want effectively two compressors, one for the left and one for the right. I want it to be compressing independently. I have a drum bus compressor and a 2-bus compressor that's going to glue things together. So I don't want the left to compress when the right is happening. And those kinds of things. I want the compressors to work independently. They're doing the same things, but they're just running independently of each other, similar to the kick. And that's how when the kick and the toms are happening at the same time or quickly within each other or quickly simultaneously from each other, they sound gelled together. So very similar compression there. And then a bit of EQ. We're literally just pulling out a little bit of that mid-range boxiness. I've got so much of it now because I've got 100 million tom tracks. I can afford to cut some of these mids, and then making it bright to sort of keep it as bright as the snare. If I play this bit again with the toms and the kick and the snare all happening at the same time, you'll hear that they make sense in the low end and the top end. Yeah, it's almost like you hear it move. Sounds cool. On the actual individual tracks themselves, so I've got this mid, which is only happens towards the end of the song. Tom low, which is the floor tom in Logic. Again, just pulling out extra low end and a bit of boxiness here, keeping the attack. So I'm basically using the Logic toms for their presence more so than anything else. Then we've got the modern and massive tom. So making sure we've got some of that low end in there. If you remember with the kick, I boosted around a similar point. So we're making sure that everything is consistent. Cutting a bit of that mid-range in there, bit of attack, cutting off the brightness so that it's not too separate sounding and fake sounding. Toms are another track that have to deal with bleed. So again, you don't usually hear a really, really clear top end to the toms when a full band arrangement is happening because you've had to deal with cymbal bleed. Then we've got the floor tom 1, pushing some of that more sort of lower mid-range in there. Some of that 2K, again, pulling out some of that overly clear brightness, rolling off the low end so I don't get too much boom. Nothing on the floor tom for that. And then nothing on the pop punk toms and nothing on the drum forge toms. So I'm basically just carving out bits that with all these toms together can build up too much, mostly keeping things intact. Let me play you the toms in solo so you can hopefully get a feel for how they sound and how toms are supposed to sound without the context of the mix. Yeah, mostly how they come out of the plugin, just a little bit brighter, and just worked on a little bit to make sure they don't build up too much in the problem areas. You see how hard it is to mix toms, because unless you've got like a loop where the toms are happening a lot, you only hear them for a split second and they're gone. That's why I adopt this less is more EQ approach, but just layer up tom sounds that I like. Right, moving into things that really make or break your drum sound, especially when working with programmed drums like we are here. Overheads and rooms. So when people send me their mixes to listen through and give feedback on, or we do one-to-ones, quite a lot of the time I feel like the rooms are being neglected, or they're in there, but when the whole mix is in, they're disappearing. So I pay a lot of attention to my room tracks, and I try and make them and the overhead work as one ambience. And I have them quite loud in my mixes, especially when doing softer pop punk, because it makes your drums sound like drums and not programmed drums. This is my overhead bus here, and this is comprised of the overheads that the band sent me. I convert drum tracks to MIDI, but I can't really do it with cymbals. If anyone out there knows of any plugins or anything that can convert cymbal to MIDI, I'd love to hear it. I know that Drumagog can do hi-hat sort of, but I don't know if anyone even uses Drumagog anymore. Is it even around? I would love some suggestions on that. But this is what we got from the band. And that's where the cymbals will be. I've got Drumforge overheads, which is just the shells, the overhead tracks for the kick, snare, and toms. And I've also got overheads from the Logic drums too. Don't always like that, how that sounds. Sometimes I kill it, sometimes I leave it in, depending on the song. Decided to leave it in for this one. So altogether we have this. So quite a lot of kick and snare in there, because I've got the Drumforge and the Logic overheads running along with the cymbals. Because these aren't problematic drums that have been recorded in a live room. They're drums that have been sampled from a live room and recorded nicely. So I can use the full, or most of the overhead track rather than just high pass filtering out most of the kick and snare. And that's what's helping this sound glued. And it's that ambience I was talking about again. This is one of those more ballady sounding pop punk songs, hence the extra ambience. If it was a bit faster, maybe I wouldn't have this Logic overhead track in there. Maybe the Drumforge one would be pulled down a little bit. But if I play you what I've got for the cymbals and I take off everything that I've done mix-wise, this is what I was sent. So already quite a lot of kick and snare in that overhead track. It's also balanced a little bit more leaning towards those kick and snares, and the cymbals are really sort of pushed back. So I wanted to make it a lot brighter because I knew I had the kick and snare and toms from the other overhead tracks. So first thing I did was try and shift the balance more towards the cymbals for this track, because I wanted to use the kick and snare that I've got in the other two. So I've pulled them back a little bit and pulled out bits where they were coming through, and a little bit of harshness here. But most of the sort of harshness of cymbals is being dealt with by Soothe, and it's the cymbal smooth preset. And I'll just toggle through the different presets that I like to use. Like you've got cymbal smooth. I think that's a Nolly one. You've also got drum room harsh, although I think you probably use it on a drum room more. You've got matte cymbals here. It'll be the matte cymbals or the cymbal smooth that I will flick back and forth and see which one sounds better. And if I have to pull back this depth, then I do that a little bit, but only if it starts to strip too much out of the cymbals. I still want them to be glimmery, and I still want them to be quite like shimmery. And then a bit of compression, again running it in dual mono, because I don't want the left and right side. I don't want the left side to be compressed if the right side is have a tom fill or something like that. And I'm bringing out the attack again because the cymbals were quite dull sounding, a little bit pushed back. I also wanted to bring out the actual attack of the cymbals a bit more, so I've slowed the attack down fast, quickened up the release there. So after that compressor, it then brought out some things that I needed to deal with again. So a bit more of that mid-range coming out, a bit more harshness being pulled out of certain places. So before we get into the actual boosting EQ, let's hear what we've got now. Yeah, it got a bit more brightness out of it without even really doing any EQing. What that compressor is bringing that out. Oh, and I should have mentioned we've got a bit of, I don't often use this anymore. I used to use it all the time. But this revival here, this shimmer, it's actually, if you have an iLok, although I think actually you don't need a physical iLok anymore for Slate stuff, but you can pick up a free, this revival is free. You just have to have an iLok or an iLok account. So a little bit of that shimmer brought in there. Other than that, it's that and the compressor working together. Let's bring in the rest of the drums, but for the purposes of this, we will mute the rooms so you can hear the overheads as opposed to a mix of the overheads and rooms. And then we'll start with the boosting EQ. We'll bring it in, because now things are going to start to change. We'll start with it bypassed, and I'll bring it in. And it's just basically a top end boost here. It's just a shelf at about 10k. So it's just that top bit of like shimmer that I'm trying to bring in. Yeah, just that top little bit of shimmer on there. And then followed up by this compressor here, which is from UAD. It's the LA2A, or you could use the CLA2A from Waves. There's even one in Logic that mimics the 2A. So it's just a bit of a slower, nicer compressor, a bit more gentle than something like an 1176. Yeah, you find with compressors that they bring out the cymbals because they sort of seem to always pull that forward. So that's why I've used the compressors to bring the cymbals forward more so than the EQ. And then last thing I've done here is put some saturation on it, a bit of tape, just to, again, make it sound less digital. With the rooms muted, you can hear how important that snare verb track was. But let's bring the rooms in now and hear it with those. See, that sounds glued. It sounds like the drums are in one room now. And it does make the cymbals a little washier, but that's how you would hear drums anyway. That's what that glue is that I often find I hear missing with when I'm listening through other people's mixes that have come to me for feedback and stuff. So the rooms sound like this by themselves. Mostly shells, because what I often do is I try and tuck the cymbals in the rooms underneath the overhead tracks. Like I said, it gets washy, so I try to bring that down and just keep that top end shimmer from the overheads in place. So this is the room track I got from the band. As you can see, this EQ, I've just pulled out some of that kick, where the kick and the low part of the snare is going to live. We've got other tracks for that. And I've pulled out the top end for the cymbals because I want to tuck it underneath the overheads. Let me show you what I'm doing with that. Yeah, just trying to pull out that cymbal, keep the sort of mid-range of the kick and snare and toms in there. And then the low end, I'm keeping that clean, but also making room for the other drum tracks that we have. So, drum forge room. And I've hyped that because we've got a compressor working with a 20 ratio here. This is the Rock My Room preset from Waves, basically. So we're slamming it. It's just one of 5 room tracks that we're slamming. We're compressing some others, I'll get to that, but we're slamming this one. We're not slamming all of the rooms. Sometimes that can work and it does sound proper energetic, but for this I'm doing it on some but not all. And then decapitator, so we're adding a bit of saturation here too. That's what gives them that hyped sound. Without them, they sound like this. Probably can't even hear it, hence this. So I've got the Logic room, again, mostly for the toms, but we've got some kick and snare in there as well. Nothing on those, just left them as is. They sound like this. And then we've got the Modern and Massive shell room with a bit of compression happening here. So 4:1 ratio, slowest attack, fastest release. So we're bringing out a bit more of energy from the transient. Sounds like this. I'm mostly just gluing the kick and snare. And when the whole mix is in, you hear it mostly on the snare anyway. And then the punk rooms, again, we're making these a bit hyped also. So a bit of compression, 4:1 ratio, but we are bringing out the transient again. Slow attack, fast release. The distortion from Logic, put the tone up to full. And then dipping out some of the top end stuff here, just because it was getting a little bit too harsh. So let me add in the rooms one by one. So we'll see how you get the whole picture. I don't want to neglect my rooms. They are so important for making it sound glued, making it sound human, real. It gives you energy. It's just really important to make sure they come through the guitars and everything else. It's not just isolated kick and snares that don't really have a home. You know, you're putting them all in the same space. So here we go. Yeah, see, it forms a big picture. With every room track that gets added, it feels more interesting to listen to. And especially this last one, this pop punk one, that's the one from my favourite snare. So obviously I want that room from that favourite snare in there too. That's what I like. I like what that does to it. And that's why when you listen to the drums, the snare changes when you bring the rooms in. If I show you the drums again, with the rooms muted, I bring them in, the snare probably has more character brought out of it when the room tracks are in than anything else. Yeah, amazing. If we mute that and we mute the snare verb track I was talking about earlier, you're going to hear why I said the ambiences, getting them right was really what felt like it brought this song to life. So hear that without the rooms and without the snare verb. Hear what the snare sounds like just trying to do it all on its own. Sounds like MIDI drums, right? To me, that sounds like fake drums, like programmed drums. Bring in the room, bring in the snare verb, and we have this. To me, that is super important, super important. So just a final few touches on the drums then. This is the drum bus here. I'm running it through a little bit of saturation just from the non-linear summer here from Waves. This is a great plugin and it's got 3 different forms of saturation or 3 different channels you can use. And it's not expensive, which is why if you can't afford Saturn from FabFilter, this is great. So I've got it on the mic channel. Brings a little bit of the low end out, that does. And then we've got our bus compressor here. So I'm actually making it punchy. In this, sometimes you might want to, it might be too punchy, too attack heavy, and you want to shave them off or bring them in. This, I'm actually bringing them out here, but I'm moving the whole drums together with this plugin, and that's sort of what bus glue is about. So slowest attack, fastest release. It's going to be subtle, but it's sort of moving all the drums together so that it's emphasizing the attack, keeping the energy consistent throughout all of them. I'll turn it off and on, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it. It's so subtle. I'll move the threshold so you can hear it actually working. But you know, I've left this super subtle. It sounds glued anyway. If you needed more glue, you would increase the threshold, make it work harder. See, we've killed it there. But you see how I've compressed it so hard that you can hear it all moving as one. It loses its life. The individual parts of the drums are actually pulled in so much now that it's just like one boring, stale sound. So you want to find a nice balance where it's not sounding too separate. You want to give it the feel that all the drums are moving together, but you don't want to do it like that where you're like choking the life out of it. Yeah, subtle. You want to feel it, you don't really want to hear it. And then another clipper. This is obviously very, very subtle, but it is more of a late in the game move where you feel like I need a bit more from my kick and snare when all the instruments are in, the vocals are in. I'm losing it a little bit. So that's what this clipper is doing here. Just about gives you a bit more crack on the snare, really. Let's hear the drum bus off and on. Yeah, bit of life. You know, with those 3 things all together, you can kind of hear what the bus glue is a bit more when you hear them all working as one, all those 3 plugins. So I want to show you how the drums sound completely raw, and then we'll bring all of this mixing in that we've done It's quite fun to do that kind of comparison. So completely raw. And mixed. So if you want to see how I would go about mixing a more up-tempo pop-punk song, then watch this video here. If you want to watch other videos on mixing pop-punk and emo and similar music, then head over to my channel. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you at the next one.